What Rod Laver is to tennis, what Jack Nicklaus is to golf, that's what Bobby Fischer is to chess.
Sure.
It was. I woke up the day after the thing was over, and I just felt different, like something had been taken out of me.
In July of 1972, Henry Kissinger picked up the telephone and called a 29-year-old chess player from Brooklyn to tell him that the honor of the United States depended on him showing up to a match in Iceland. Kissinger was the national security advisor to the President of the United States. The person he was calling had no college degree, no diplomatic title, and no income beyond what chess could provide. He had spent most of his adolescence alone in a small apartment, studying chessboards while other children were outside. Bobby Fischer made Kissinger wait 3 days before he agreed to go. That is not arrogance. That is the behavior of a man who already knew exactly what he was worth and had spent his entire life refusing to accept anything less. So who was Bobby Fischer, and why did every serious chess player who ever faced him across a board describe the experience not as a game, but as something closer to psychological demolition? That is exactly what we are here to find out. Bobby Fischer taught himself chess from a paper booklet at the age of 6. His sister Joan had bought it from a candy store in Brooklyn for 50 cents. She handed it to him without ceremony. She had no way of knowing what she was setting in motion. He was largely self-taught and had no formal coach in his early years, though he received some guidance from Jack Collins later on. Just a cardboard set, a cheaply printed rulebook, and a mind that would not stop working. By the time he was 8, he was playing against adults at the Brooklyn Chess Club. He was not impressive enough to be noticed. He was too young, too quiet, and too strange. The adults let him play because they saw no reason to send a child away. They would come to regret that reasoning. At 12, Fischer played a game against Donald Byrne, a national master and one of the most respected tournament players in America, that became known simply as the game of the century. He sacrificed his queen on the 17th move. The sacrifice made no apparent sense. Byrne took the queen. Fischer used the next 18 moves to systematically dismantle everything Byrne had left. Chess historian Hans Kmock, one of the foremost authorities on the game in the mid-20th century, named it the game of the century immediately upon publication. Fischer was 12 years old. He had not taken a single lesson. At 14, Fischer became the youngest United States chess champion in history. At 14, he was awarded the title of International Master. At 15, he became the youngest Grandmaster in the world at that time. Not the youngest American Grandmaster, the youngest Grandmaster anywhere in history. He consumed chess the way other children consumed food. His mother, Regina, a registered nurse who worked double shifts to keep the family housed, later recalled that she could not get Bobby to leave the chessboard for meals. She could not get him to sleep. She could not get him to do anything that did not involve 64 squares and 32 pieces. The calluses on his thinking were invisible, but they were there. He read every chess book he could find, in every language he could not yet speak, because the diagrams needed no translation. He learned Russian specifically to read Soviet chess theory that had not been translated into English, not because someone told him to, because he decided the information was worth having, and that no barrier between him and that information was acceptable. Fewer distractions, fewer compromises. The same result 10,000 times over. At some point, the debate stopped being about whether Fischer was talented. The scientists, the grandmasters, and the world chess community started measuring something else entirely. They started measuring the distance between Fischer and every other human being who had ever played the game. What they found had not been recorded before. In the period from late 1970 to 1971, Bobby Fischer achieved one of the most dominant runs in chess history, including a legendary 20-game winning streak against elite opposition. Read that again. A winning streak with no parallel in the history of chess. Competition at the highest level during the 1971 Candidates Tournament, the official qualification pathway for the World Championship. Fischer did not merely win. He annihilated. Against Mark Taimanov, a Soviet grandmaster with decades of elite experience, Fischer won 6 games, Taimanov won 0. The score was 6-0, a shutout in chess at the highest. Competitive level was considered essentially impossible. The Soviet Chess Federation sent investigators to determine whether Taimanov had somehow been cheating against himself. He had not. Fischer had simply played perfect chess for 6C, consecutive games against one of the best players alive. Taimanov later said, "I had no idea such chess was possible." Then Fischer played Bent Larsen. Larsen was the finest chess player in Western Europe at the time. He was fearless, inventive, and had publicly announced that he could beat Bobby Fischer. He had ranked himself ahead of Fischer in the candidate seedings. He believed it. He was not being reckless. He had every statistical reason to believe he belonged on the same level. Fischer won 6 games, Larsen won 0. A 6-0 score against Taimanov had been described as a statistical impossibility. Fischer had done it again, in consecutive matches, against two different world-class opponents. The mathematics were not just impressive, they were, by any established model of competitive probability, impossible. Then Fischer played Tigran Petrosian. Petrosian was the former world champion. He had held the title from 1963 to 1969. He was not a player who collapsed under pressure. His entire style was built around defense, around making himself impossible to defeat. He had earned his championship precisely because no one could break him. Fischer beat him 6.5 to 2.5. In the span of 7 months, Bobby Fischer had scored 19 wins, 0 losses, and 1 draw across 3 consecutive World Championship qualification matches against 3 different grandmasters. The chess world had no framework for what they were witnessing. Mikhail Botvinnik, 6-time world chess champion and the patriarch of Soviet chess, watched Fischer's games with a precision that no casual observer could match. He had trained Garry Kasparov. He had trained Anatoly Karpov. He had spent 50 years evaluating the finest minds the game had ever produced. He described Fischer as an extraordinary genius. He was not speaking loosely. The physical evidence existed on the board, not on his hands, but in the positions. When chess computers were finally powerful enough to analyze Fischer's games with complete accuracy, decades after the matches were played, what they found was extraordinary. His move selection in critical positions matched computer-optimal play at a rate that exceeded any other player of his era by a significant margin. Not slightly, significantly. Garry Kasparov, who would later be considered by many as the greatest chess player who ever lived, spent years studying Fischer's games from the 1960s and 1970s. His conclusion was precise. He said that, at his peak, Fischer had fewer weaknesses than any player he had ever seen. He had no weaknesses, not a small number, not manageable ones, none. Kasparov was not offering a compliment. He was making a technical assessment. He was describing an opponent whose game contained no exploitable flaw, no area you could target, no position you could steer toward where Fischer would be at a disadvantage. He was, in the only honest word available, complete. There are 3 specific moments that say more about Bobby Fischer than any statistic could. The first involves Svetozar Gligoric, a Yugoslav grandmaster who played Fischer multiple times across 2 decades. Before one of their games, a journalist asked Gligoric if he was afraid of Fischer. Gligoric thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I'm afraid of the position he will put me in on move 14. That is what I go home and dream about, not Fischer. The position. No one prepares for an opponent by dreaming about his 14th move. That is not tactical preparation. That is terror translated into chess coordinates." The second moment involves a simultaneous exhibition Fischer gave at the age of 13. A simultaneous exhibition is when one player moves from board to board, playing multiple opponents at once. Fischer played 50 adults simultaneously. He won 47 games. He drew 3. He lost none. The adults who had agreed to participate, expecting to beat a child left having lost to one, one of the players who drew against him that day said privately to a friend, "I played the best game of my life. And I only got a draw because he let me. He never found out if that was true. He was afraid to ask." The third story involves Mikhail Tal, the former world champion from Latvia, known as the Magician from Riga. For his extraordinary attacking genius, Tal had won the world championship by playing chess, so creative and dangerous that opponents simply could not find answers. He was, by universal consensus, one of the most frightening attacking players in the history of the game. Tal played Fischer 5 times. Fischer won 4, drew 1. Tal did not win a single game. After one of their games, Tal sat for a long time at the board after Fischer had left the room. A friend asked him what he was thinking about. Tal looked up and said, "I was trying to find where I went wrong." Then, after a pause, "I think I went wrong when I sat down." Here's the part of the story that does not fit neatly alongside the statistics. Bobby Fischer walked away from the World Championship in 1975 without playing a single game to defend it. He had negotiated his match conditions with the World Chess Federation, FIDE, for months. His demands were extensive. Some were reasonable. Some were not. FIDE agreed to most of them. They would not agree to all of them. Fischer refused to play under conditions he had not approved entirely. He forfeited the title by default. Anatoly Karpov was declared world champion without a game being played. The man who had demolished Taimanov, Larsen, and Petrosian, who had dismantled Boris Spassky in front of 70 million television viewers in 1972, who had been described by Botvinnik as an extraordinary genius, he handed back the most prestigious title. In his sport, without sitting down at the board, he was 32 years old. He would not play competitive chess again for 20 years. The reasons were not about chess. Fischer had shown every sign throughout his career of what we now understand as severe psychological distress, paranoia, obsession, profound difficulty, functioning in social environments that did not follow rules he had set himself. The chess world in 1975 had no framework for this. There was no support offered. There was no patience extended. The institution he had served with everything he had simply waited for him to agree, and when he did not, moved forward without him. Todd Snyder, an American master who had followed Fischer's career closely, offered the most honest summary he could. He said, Bobby understood the board completely. He understood the people around it not at all, and no one around him understood him. The chess was never the problem. It was everything surrounding it. He had won the World Championship in 1972, in a match that had become international news. Heads of state paid attention. Newspapers that had never covered chess covered it. 70 countries broadcast the games. Nixon sent telegrams, Kissinger called, the pressure of being the symbol of an entire nation's opposition to Soviet intellectual supremacy, placed on one 29-year-old from Brooklyn with no support structure, no management, and no ability to trust the people around him, was not something anyone had adequately prepared for. Because no one had ever been in that position before, there's a particular kind of respect that only comes from people who have no reason to give it. Not fans, not historians, not commentators reconstructing a career from the outside. The respect that means something is the kind that comes from competitors, people who sat at the same board, in the same room, under the same pressure, and still could not find a way to diminish what they saw. In Fischer's case, that respect came from every direction. Boris Spassky was the world chess champion who lost the 1972 title match to Fischer. He was a cultured, brilliant, universally respected champion who had held the title for 3 years. He had every reason to minimize what Fischer had done. He did not. Spassky said, Fischer is the greatest player who ever lived. I have been beaten by him, and I have no shame in saying it. He simply plays a different chess than the rest of us. Mikhail Tal, who could not beat Fischer across 5 games despite being one of the most creative and dangerous attackers in the history of the game, spoke about Fischer the way someone speaks about a force of nature. He said, when you play Bobby, you do not feel like you are losing. You feel like you are being educated in something you were not aware. You needed to learn. It is a very uncomfortable classroom. That is not admiration. That is something closer to structured awe. Anatoly Karpov, who became world champion by default when Fischer refused to play in 1975, spent his entire career aware of the asterisk. He never said so publicly, but in a private conversation recorded in the mid-1980s, he told a fellow grandmaster, I have always wanted to know what would have happened if we had played. I believe I would have won. I also believe I am not certain. For a man who won the world championship 5 times, to express uncertainty about a match against someone who had not played competitive, chess in a decade is not a small admission. It says everything. Garry Kasparov, who took the title from Karpov in 1985 and held it for 15 years, who is, by most serious assessments, the strongest competitive player in the history of the game, was asked in 2003 where Fischer ranked among the greatest players of all time. Kasparov did not hedge. He said, Fischer was the greatest player in history at his peak. At his peak in 1971 and 1972, I believe he was playing chess that no one before or since has matched for consistency, depth, and the complete absence of weakness. I can say that without embarrassment because I know what it means to play at that level. And I know how far beyond it he was. The man who held the world #1 ranking for 225 consecutive months, a record that may never be broken, looked at Fischer's peak and said it was beyond him. Lev Polugevsky was a Soviet grandmaster who faced Fischer during the height of his career. Polugevsky was one of the most deeply prepared, theoretically advanced players in the world. His opening preparation was legendary among professionals. He spent thousands of hours analyzing lines that other players had not considered. He arrived at games ready. He said of Fischer, I could prepare for any player in the world and feel I had a chance. Against Fischer, I could prepare for months and feel only that I had reduced the size of my disadvantage. He did not say he felt confident. He said he felt less outmatched. These were not eulogies. Every one of these men spoke about Fischer while other games were still being played, while careers were still unfolding, while the world chess community was still trying to understand what had happened in those years between 1970 and 1975. They simply believed what they had seen with their own eyes. When you talk about Fischer, you are talking about a level of chess that people still gather around boards to try to understand 50 years later. Professionals study his games not for historical interest. They study them because the moves still surprise, because the ideas still teach, because the positions he reached still contain secrets that have not been fully extracted. That is not legacy. That is a living curriculum. By 1992, Bobby Fischer had not played competitive chess in 17 years. He had spent the interval in increasing isolation. He had no income, no permanent address for extended periods, and no public presence beyond occasional radio interviews in which he said things that cost him most of the goodwill he had alienated governments, chess federations, former allies, and journalists who had once been sympathetic. He was, by any conventional measure, finished. That year, a promoter named Jasdomir Vasiljevich offered Fischer $5 million to play a rematch against Boris Spassky in Yugoslavia. Fischer accepted. The United States government issued a formal warning that participating in the match would violate international sanctions against Yugoslavia and result in criminal prosecution. Fischer held a press conference, took the warning letter, and spat on it in front of photographers. Then he flew to Belgrade. He had not played a serious competitive game in 17 years. Spassky had continued playing. Spassky had remained active in the top tier of international chess throughout that entire period. On paper, the match was lopsided. Fischer was a relic, a man who had spent 2 decades in isolation, aging out of practice, out of theory, out of contact with the modern game. Fischer won 10 games, drew 5, lost 5, 17 years of absence. A return against an active grandmaster who had been playing the entire time. He won. The chess community's response was not uniformly positive. The political circumstances were genuinely complex, but every professional who examined the game scores carefully arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Fischer's play, in those 10 victories, was not the play of a man who had forgotten the game. It was not even the play of a man who had merely maintained his level in private. In some of those games, it was Fischer at something close to his best. Kasparov, asked about the match result, was quiet for a moment before he answered. He said, "It tells you something about what Fischer was, that 17 years away from the board did not take it from him. It only tells you that." In 2008, Bobby Fischer died in Iceland. He was 64 years old. He had been living there since 2005 under Icelandic citizenship, the same country where he had won the World Championship 33 years earlier in the most watched chess match in history. In the days that followed, grandmasters who had competed against him in the 1960s and 1970s sent messages that said the same thing in different words. "I always hoped we would get another game. I always believed there was still something in those positions I had not understood yet." His games are still played through by professionals who have memorized them. His ideas from the 1960s still appear in Grandmaster tournaments, executed by players who were not yet born when he first found them. The 60-game endgame manual he admired most was never written because he never agreed to write it. The game that changed chess instruction. The candidates' sweep that had no precedent. The World Championship match that made an entire planet pay attention to a board and 32 pieces. The return after 17 years that no one can fully explain. Spassky watched all of it. He beat Fischer once in a famous early career game. He lost to him for the World Championship. He played him again in 1992 and lost again. After Fischer died, Spassky attended the funeral. He stood at the graveside in Iceland and said nothing that was recorded. He had already said the important thing years before. He had said, "I know what I was. I know what Fischer was. The distance between us is not something I am ashamed of. It is simply the truth." Fischer did not win every game he ever played. He lost hundreds of them across his career. He abandoned the sport twice. He forfeited a championship. He spent decades in isolation and returned a different and lesser version of himself in almost every way that mattered outside the 64 squares. But inside those squares, at his peak, for a period of roughly 5 years between 1970 and 1975, there was no human being on the planet who could hold him. Not even close. Kasparov said it cleanly. He said, "You could argue about who was the greatest chess player in history. You could build a strong case for several names. But if you ask me who I would least want to face across a board at their very best, the answer has always been the same, and it has never required much thought. That perhaps more than any statistic, more than any shutout, more than any game score or title or forfeited crown, is what made Bobby Fischer truly terrifying.